No Abyssinia Empire without Europeans and the USA, the enablers. History is rarely a simple story of heroes and villains. When we look at the narrative of the scramble for Africa, we are often presented with a binary: the civilizing European powers versus the indigenous resistance movements. However, a closer look at the Abyssinia Empire and European colonial powers reveals a startling and uncomfortable set of commonalities that challenge the traditional historical binary. While Abyssinia is often celebrated as the sole African nation to successfully repel European colonialism, historical records tell a more complex story, one in which the practices of the Abyssinian ruling class mirrored, in many ways, the oppressive structures of their European counterparts. A critical yet often overlooked comparison exists between the warlords of Abyssinian history and the European colonial powers that sought to dominate Africa. Despite their differences in geography and technology, the structural similarities, and the moral failures they shared were profound. 1. The shadow of enslavement, traders and holders. A foundational yet often overlooked truth is that both the Ethiopian Empire and European colonial powers were deeply entrenched in human bondage. Long before the European scramble, and continuing well into the 20th century, Abyssinia functioned as a major hub for the slave trade. The ruling elite utilized the enslavement of peripheral, non-Amharic, and non-Tigrayan ethnic groups to fuel the economy and domestic labor force. While European powers utilized the transatlantic route, Abyssinia utilized regional networks, but the morality of the practice remained the same. Both systems treated humans as capital, stripping them of their autonomy to serve the interests of an elite class. 2. The architecture of deception, racism and lies. Both the Ethiopian imperial state and European colonizers operated under the banner of moral superiority, justified by systematic deceit. European, scientific, racism was used to rationalize the subjugation of the African continent. Similarly, within the Abyssinian context, a form of internal racial and cultural hierarchy was employed to justify the conquest and subjugation of neighboring peoples. The Europeans' civilizing mission was mirrored by the expansionist rhetoric of the Abyssinian Empire, which often characterized its own territorial acquisitions as divine mandates, masking the reality of violent land theft and cultural erasure behind a veneer of righteousness. 3. The myth as a weapon, Christianity of Hebrew folklore. The most potent tool for both was the appropriation of religious narratives of Christianity by the state. Both European colonizers and the Abyssinian elite utilized the third-hand translated versions of what was called specifically elements of the Pentateuch, 5 books, or Torah, a collection of oral traditions and written scrolls within the Hebrew-speaking communities of the Levant called Bible by Christians. With the conversion of Constantine and the subsequent adoption of Christianity as the Roman state religion and institutionalized at 4th century CE, the Latin Vulgata, produced by Jerome, c. 380–405 CE, crystallized the Pentateuch as a universal European text, moving it from the synagogue to the European church. At the same period, the warlord of 𝗔𝗯𝘆𝘀𝗀, 𝗔𝗯𝘃 was mentored and converted to Coptic Christianity by his childhood tutor, a Syrian Greek Christian named Frumentius. 𝗔𝗯𝘃 mimicked the Roman emperor and declared it as the official religion of 𝗔𝗯𝘃. From her departed their solidarity, brotherhood of common domain that neither of them have nothing within it, a strange Northwest Asian people's cultures. Under the banner of the Christian cross was frequently marched ahead of the colonial flag. They weaponized to justify the expansion of territory, the extraction of resources, and the subjugation of the aboriginal populations of the world, with the ambitions of empire building moving with logic of elimination. By framing their rule as ordained by God, they turned the myth of Christianity into a political weapon. For Europeans, it was the white man's burden. For the Abyssinian hierarchy, it was the Solomonic legend, which claimed a direct, divine lineage from King Solomon. These narratives were not merely spiritual beliefs. They were sophisticated instruments of propaganda used to sanitize systemic violence, frame their victims as lesser, and silence dissent against the state's cruelty. 4. Resources excavation. Of all the continent, Europe was, and is the most 𝗔𝗯𝘆𝘀𝘀 and paradoxical, the most avaricious and smallest continent of all. Analogical Abyssinia, 𝗔𝗳𝗍𝗶𝗰𝗀, are characterized by rugged, mountainous highlands, deep gorges, dominated by steep terrains, dramatic altitude shifts, the poorest in the region. Both were hungry for resources, often leading to desperate, violent raids, or tribute-seeking. To maintain their apparatus of control, often turned to the most exploitative forms of extraction, slavery and land appropriation, as a means of survival. This desperation fuels the cycle of violence, where the need to secure wealth justifies the commission of crimes against humanity. Deconstructing the myth. Why is this comparison important? This is important because acknowledging these parallels is the first step toward a more honest history. By deconstructing the myth of the noble resistor versus the evil colonizer, we see that the structures of oppression, the use of religion, the justification of racism, and the commodification of human life are universal tools of power. Recognizing that the Abyssinian Empire employed the same tools of subjugation as their European contemporaries does not invalidate the tragedy of colonialism. Instead, it expands our understanding of history, forcing us to confront the fact that the capacity for exploitation and human rights abuse is not the exclusive domain of any one people or continent. True justice requires us to examine the actions of all historical actors through the same critical, uncompromising lens. The shadow of history, the uncomfortable parallels, and the truth between Abyssinian warlords, chieftains, clerks, etc., and European colonizers, since their first encounter in history to the present, must be revealed. However, when we strip away the nationalist rhetoric and romanticized myths, we often find that the actors on these opposing sides of history share a remarkably similar playbook. A critical yet often overlooked comparison exists between the warlords of Abyssinian history and the European colonial powers that sought to dominate Africa. Despite their differences in geography and technology, the structural similarities, and the moral failures they shared were profound. Here, we examine the unsettling commonalities that define these two groups. The economy of human suffering. At the core of both Abyssinian expansionism and European colonialism was a dehumanizing, economic engine. Both entities were deeply entrenched in the slave trade industry. Whether it was the systemic chattel slavery fueled by the European transatlantic trade, or the internal raiding and enslavement practices used by regional warlords to consolidate power and wealth, the result was the same: commodification of human life. Both groups viewed people as resources to be captured, traded, and exploited, proving that the drive for profit often transcends cultural and continental divisions. The architecture of deception and supremacy. Both European colonizers and Abyssinian warlords relied on an ideology of superiority to justify their expansion. This was rooted in pervasive racism and a deliberate commitment to falsehood. By framing the other as inferior, uncivilized, or subhuman, they created the necessary moral distance to commit atrocities. They were master manipulators of the truth, constructing narratives of progress and order to mask the reality of displacement, theft, and violence. The myth of scarcity. It is a historical irony that both groups, in their pursuit of dominance, were often driven by fundamental poverty of spirit and resources. Many of the invading warlords and colonial outposts were, at their foundations, resource-poor entities seeking to sustain themselves through the extraction of another's wealth. Their imperial ambitions were rarely born from prosperity. They were born from a desperate, predatory need to secure what they did not possess through force rather than through cooperation. The weaponization of faith. Perhaps the most egregious parallel is the cynical use of religion to sanctify the brutality. Both Abyssinian warlords and European colonists frequently invoked the narratives of Hebrew folklore and Christian theology to provide a divine mandate for their violence against the Oromo. By draping their territorial invasions, cultural erasures, and genocidal acts in the mantle of holy missions or divine right. They sought to insulate themselves from earthly judgment. This appropriation of scripture transformed human greed into a religious duty, effectively turning faith into a tool for oppression. History reminds us that when leaders claim that their crimes are ordained by a higher power, it is usually a sign that they have abandoned the moral teachings they claim to uphold. Moving beyond the myth. Recognizing these parallels is not about equating every historical figure or event. It is about acknowledging that the machinery of oppression functions similarly, regardless of who operates it. Whether it was the colonial powers spreading across the globe or regional warlords carving out empires in the Horn of Africa, the patterns of enslavement, systemic racism, and manipulation of faith remain consistent. To understand history honestly, we must stop viewing these groups as heroes and villains in a binary drama and start seeing them for what they were. Actors in a global history of exploitation who used the same dark tactics to achieve the same selfish ends. Only by peeling back the layers of myth can we confront the true nature of power and the devastating cost of the ideologies that are used to maintain it. First and foremost, thank you. Whether you've lingered on a single line, bookmarked an entire post, or simply skimmed through the headlines, your curiosity is the true engine behind every piece we create. Your time, attention, and the occasional aha moment you share in the comments are the quiet applause that tells us we're on the right track. In short, you're not just a reader. You're a co-author of this growing community, and we're grateful for every glance, every share, and every thoughtful reply. If you've found value in what you've read, we'd love to keep the conversation going. Subscribing to our newsletter or channel ensures you won't miss future insights, tips, or the occasional behind-the-scenes glimpse that we reserve for our most engaged audience. And if something resonated with you, please hit the share button. Your friends, colleagues, or anyone else who could benefit from the information will thank you as much as we do. Finally, don't let the dialogue end here. Drop a comment, ask a question, or share your own experience. Your voice not only enriches the discussion, but also helps shape the content we produce next. Thank you for being part of this journey. Let's keep learning, growing, and connecting together.